Alrighty. So I just sat here for like 15 minutes debating if I even want to do this one right now, but I will. It's 12 pages, um, which is pretty brutal as far as these go. Um, and, the first will is notorious. So I guess I'm just going to power through it. I'm going to try to, I'm going to try to summon the energy of the first wills who are reading this, and I'm going to subject them to first will. All right. The first will is a born leader. They say that leaders are not born, but made. However, this, like many other common truths, does not stand the test of experience. Leaders are born not only in humans but also in animals. For example, chickens have barely hatched and they already know which of them is which, as biologists say, is an alpha individual. And she herself knows that she is an alpha, and she is the first to march to the feeder, mercifully following the orders. Mercifully allowing the others to leave beta to omega move after yourself. So letting the others, move in their own order. And the established pecking order never changes. One gets the impression that the volitional order of functions exists not only in chickens, but even in mosquitoes. In this regard, I will allow myself a small lyrical digression of a purely personal nature. And this is a pretty funny story. At one time, I had the opportunity to serve as a night watchman. The building I was guarding was ancient, with warm, deep basements where mosquitoes bred unchecked from early spring until late autumn. So I had more than enough time and material to observe the customs and way of life of the mosquito people. So, lying in the darkness on a cot and listening to the night singing of a mosquito, I noticed that mosquitoes are not as monotonous as they look during country walks. As soon as they see a person, they all rush straight to drink his blood. The experience of the night watchman convinced me that the picture is more complex, that there are significant differences in the character and behavior of individual mosquitoes. Some mosquitoes, apparently with the fourth will, appeared in my room as if by chance, at first only timidly moving along the walls, portraying idle onlookers interested exclusively in architecture. Then, just as without a plan or personal interest, the mosquitoes began to circle, now approaching, now moving away, and approaching again in obvious hesitation. However, usually as soon as you waved your hand in their direction, they themselves, immediately agreeing with the hopelessness of further attempts, flew away. Other mosquitoes, probably with the third will, were just as timid as at first, but showed much more persistence in achieving their goal. For a long time, and consistently squeezing the circle with their circles, they did not calm down until they sat down on me. A clap of the palm followed, and if it did not finish off the bloodsucker, then the mosquito returned to its original distant position, and the careful, deadly hunt for me was resumed. But one day I felt that it was not just a mosquito that was interested in me. Easily and quickly rushing into the room without hesitation or unnecessary thought, he rushed straight at me. The categorical straightforwardness of his behavior created the impression that he had no shadow of a doubt about his right to suck my blood. I, categorically disagreeing with this and at the same time not finding the mental strength to openly fight, cowardly covered myself with a blanket. The mosquito, busily flapping its wings, flew up and sat down on the blanket. I don't undertake to explain where this feeling came from, but it seemed that this tiny creature was literally trampling on me. And after standing for a short time as if surveying his possessions, he began to flutter from place to place, slowly plunging his long nose into the folds and holes of the blanket, in the vain hope of getting to my veins. I lay neither alive nor dead, although there was no reason to doubt the thickness of the blanket. But then the royal mosquito made a mistake. From the irritated and panicky crack of its wings, I realized that my tormentor had overdone it and fell into one of the folds of the blanket. God, who would have had known with what pleasure I, Everest compared to a mosquito, crushed this tiny but extremely self confident creature? Later, of course, came the shame of the pleasure I experienced, but I still cannot say with complete confidence that the struggle then was unequal. This is the effect that the appearance of the first will can cause. even if it is from a different, incomparable level and world. Everest, compared to a mosquito, crushed this tiny but extremely self confident creature. Later, of course, came the shame of the pleasure I experienced. Okay, I think it might. Okay, yeah, it repeats there. So ignore that. To this purely personal story, I will add a similar sounding historical anecdote. When General Bonaparte, appointed commander in chief of the Italian army, still unknown to anyone, arrived at headquarters, the first thing he decided to do was assemble a military council. Uh, Soon, officers not inferior in rank to Napoleon entered the commander's office. Handsome men, heroes, grunts, against whom the small, thin, yellow faced Bonaparte clearly did not look good. The commander met them with a hat on his head, and other generals did not bare their heads either. During the conversation, Bonaparte took off his hat. They followed his example, but a minute later he put his hat back on and looked at those around him so much that no one dared to repeat his gesture. Later, when the military council was over, the hero, the brave Messina, muttered, "Well, this fellow gave me fear." And then the translation cuts off. But that's another good like kind of story of just like Bonaparte's kind of like frame and self confidence. Um, all right, sorry, losing my place here. The main thing to start with when analyzing the psychology of the first will is that it is born with a two-layer picture of the universe. I think this is important. Uh, in the subconscious of the king, the entire cosmos and all its elements are built into a simple hierarchy of two levels, top and bottom. All that exists is divided into the high and low worlds, heaven and earth, the chosen and the called, the authorities and the people, shepherd and flocks, householders and household members, etc. At the same time, a remarkable feature of the psychology of the first will seems to be that from birth it feels itself involved in no other, namely the highest, elite, exclusive, chosen stage of this two-stage model. Tolstoy wrote, "There is something in me that makes me believe that I was not born to be like everyone else." And decades later, Salvador Dali echoed Tolstoy. And unfortunately, the translation is cut off there. So, uh, the first will's premonition of one's chosenness is not just a vague feeling secretly living in a person. It is the program, character, image, and meaning of an individual's life. It is something embodied in everything that the king does, thinks, and feels. Yeah, something I just remembered is that despite the section being so long, it seems like there's actually a lot of places where the translation just cuts off. So apologies for that. And also, I just want to remark on the two worlds in this division, and you can see how volition and the will is kind of like it's more than just like power and like ambition. There's also something like spiritual about it. Like there's something like it has to do with like fate and like kind of vision and I don't know, the words aren't coming to me right now, but it's more than just like mere willpower, like mere exertion of energy. There is something like higher, which makes sense because really it's the spirit, and like we can call it will or volition or whatever, but we're talking about like the spirit, right? Um, so anyway, belonging to the higher of the two worlds makes some adjustments to the first will's ideas about the norms of law and ethics. The Tsar, he calls it like king and Tsar. The Tsar cannot in any case be called an immoral being. He respects the law and does not like to violate the norms established in society. But a certain duality associated with the two-stage picture of the universe is present in the ethics and law of the first will. Unconditional fulfillment of all rules, in her opinion, is necessary for creatures belonging to the second, lower world. As for the beings of the higher world, for them compliance with the norms of law and morality must, but not unconditionally, but insofar as there are situations when the highest expediency allows their violation. Um, it's a little muddled there, but basically that the beings of the higher world um, have a different set of norms and laws. And usually what this is a sort of like self affirmation, like kind of like a Nietzscheanism, where the beings of the lower world, like they're supposed to follow the law, like they're because they're lower, really their ethics is to follow the rules, right? That are of course set by the higher beings. And for the higher beings, their code of morality is to be great men and women, to achieve and to subjugate others. Um, do, do, do. Okay. The motivations here are very different, but in the end, it always turns out the ultimate goal of the amoralism of the first will is power, career, self-affirmation. And he was going to give an example with Luther, but it cuts off. Associated with the two-stage picture of the universe is the consciousness of the first will, is another curious, deceiving feature of the king's behavior. His imaginary democracy. The fact is that the first will really treats others equally without distinguishing between ranks and titles. However, the source of this phenomenon is not in natural democracy, but in the simplicity of the picture living inner soul. There is only top and bottom, and more complex hierarchical structures are arbitrary and crafty. So arbitrary and artificial. And that, I mean, this whole section is like pretty bang on, I have to say. He really gets at one V, and often not super, favorably. Although he does give the favorable interpretations as well. But yeah, it's like 1V types. They don't care about rank and decor, because to them that's just probably someone else's like rules. And 1V types, they just care about willpower, because that's what they see. That's what they're possessed by, is the will. So they've seen others is this a great man or is this a follower? And it doesn't matter what rank they're on. Okay. Formally, the first will is a supporter of equality, but a kind of equality where everyone is equal not in rights, but in lack of rights in front of her. Yeah. In this regard, it is interesting to observe the egalitarianism of the first will, using the example of Emperor Paul I. On the one hand, Paul constantly scolded the Russian aristocrats as Jacobins because they claimed, albeit conditionally, but still equally with him, the Tsar first among equals. On the other hand, the aristocracy treated Paul as a leveler and sans culotte. So a leveler would be someone who promotes like egalitarianism. Since he did not distinguish between ranks and titles among his subjects, flogging with equal passion everyone who came to hand. Once, when they tried to express condolences to Paul over the death of Chancellor Bezborodko, he very egalitarianly replied, "I'm all beardless." So that I know with Russians back in the day there was something with like beards, but I'm not sure how that applies exactly. Like beard is demoted to like social rank or something. Yeah, I can't remember exactly. There is equality for the royal, meaning the 1V. Therefore, it is not surprising that the Russian aristocracy soon got tired of such equality and sent the sans culotte czar to another world. Life is richer than the two-stage model of the world, richer than the czar's idea of equality, and violence against society in the spirit of the elementary opposition of top to bottom often takes cruel revenge on the czar. Yep, that is pretty bang on. The premonition of belonging to a higher world not only subjugates the entire, again, belonging to a higher world, right? This is, you can see like there's something spiritual. Like it's not, 1V is not just like, it's not just about power, and Volition in general is not just about this like power thing. It's spiritual. Like it's about like there's something mystical in Volition, and that's why I give it as a parallel to Jung's intuitive function. Okay, where 1V, I mean, people who are used to socionics will balk at this, but ignore socionics completely, in my opinion. But 1V is actually parallel to introverted intuition, and 2V is parallel to extroverted intuition. Uh, at least or I should say, like strong introverted intuition and a strong extroverted intuition, meaning higher in the functional order in Jung's system. So there's something like mystical. So belonging to a higher world, when you make this separation between a leader and follower, it's cool the way Afanasiev then notices, well, there's an implication. You then abstract that not only to politics, but also to the universe. So just as like the first logic type metaphysically believes in a universe that's held together by a great mind, okay? The first volition type immediately imagines, well, there's this world, but then there's like the higher world. There's the superior world with superior beings. So the first volition, kind of creates this mystical other, right? Um, Imaginary, or maybe it's real. I don't know. That's a question for philosophers, right? But um, nonetheless, they act as regardless of right and wrong. That phenomenon still happens where they often have this like spiritual belief in like this ideal higher world of leaders that they are connected to and they are destined to ascend to. Okay. Um, the okay. The premonition of belonging to a higher world not only subjugates the entire personality of the first will without a trace, but literally distorts and rapes it. And I think he means, rape in like the broader sense of distorts and corrupts it, right? The life of the king is initially tragic because, feeling like an alpha chicken, he forces himself to behave in accordance with his implications about the behavior of the alpha, sometimes contrary to his own internal inclinations and needs. The trouble is that the first will allows the functions located below to be realized only in royal, hierarchically elevated forms, while, say, the second function is by nature a consistent democrat, and in its inclination towards process and richness of expression, is completely alien to aristocratic attempts. That's pretty interesting, right? This is when I was back in Attitudinal Psyche Discord, someone mentioned this phenomenon with 1V types, meaning first volition, meaning first will types. This kind of like the reverso of first will, like oftentimes, and he'll get into this more, but oftentimes people will think that a VL type, VLFE, VLEF, they might think that they're a first logic type, but really it's because they're volitionizing their logic. So they're elevating their second function. They're taking it, they're making it seem dogmatic, but it's not actually that their logic is dogmatic. It's just that there's like this force behind it, this this ambition, this willpower that's behind it, that's making it seem like it comes across like stronger than it is. It comes across more aggressively. So 1Bs kind of make their lower functions a little more aggressive and hierarchical than types that have a different first function. So just something to consider when you're typing people. To make it clearer, I'll give Napoleon as an example. At first will, he had second physics. And the second physics, as already mentioned, is a wonderful lover. It brings processivity, strength, flexibility, versatility, naturalness, and caring to sex. And probably Napoleon, with his second physics, indulging in love pleasures with Countess Waluska, was just like that. But he was not always like this, and not with everyone. Having become emperor, Napoleon made it a rule to rape the wives of his ministers, and he did this with the state Duma on his forehead, carelessly and without unfastening his sword. Okay. So he didn't even take off his sword when he did this. God knows from what recesses of his Corsican memory he dug up the memory of the rite of the first night. And this is not significant. The significant thing is that by performing all the necessary manipulations in such cases, without even unfastening the sword, he raped not only the wives of his ministers, but he first of all raped his own sexually strong and rich nature. So he betrayed his 2F. His 1V and his, personal idiosyncrasies, because obviously not all 1v types are, rapists or whatever, but his 1v betrayed his 2f. Why? Violence over the second physics from Napoleon was demanded by his own royal first will. The fact that such self-torture must be carried out through the wives of ministers and with a sword is only an individual poor idea of the forms in which a statesman of the highest calling should perform his sex. Um, and for example, like I mentioned before about, the first volition, second logic types, like I have a friend who I think is very open-minded, but it's like with VLEFs, it's like they're like, you have to debate me. Like, you must give me information. Like, why are you not giving me information? And it's like very aggressive, and like he's even talked about this because he's made public videos before, and he's kind of complained that people have this idea that he's dogmatic, and really he's not. And I think he's right. I don't think he's really truly dogmatic. I think it's just he comes across like that due to the aggressiveness of the first volition, which kind of betrays the natural, conversationalism and dialogism of the, second function generally, but specifically the second logic. So yeah, it's 1v does this weird thing with that. So even the super processive third function forces the first will, even with the super processive third function, forces one to grimace and double deal, making its action dependent on public opinion. About Leo Tolstoy, who had the third physics, i.e., a physicist who was painfully caring and compassionate, his own wife wrote bitterly, if anyone knew how little tender, true kindness he had, and how much was done according to principle and not according to heart, they would write in his biography that he carried water as a janitor, whatever that means, and no one will ever know what kind of wife he is. I guess what kind of wife, maybe that's supposed to be no one will ever know what kind of husband he is, or what kind of wife I am. I'm not sure. In order to at least ever give her rest, he did not give his child water to drink, and at the age of 32, he did not sit with a sick person for 5 minutes. So he wouldn't sit with sick people. The examples of Napoleon and Tolstoy, at first glance, indicate that in connection with the phenomenon of the first will, everything said requires revision. The effect of first will seems to cancel the processionality of the second and third functions, and the entire personality of the king in the image of the first function becomes effective. However, this is an appearance. The king does not actually cancel, but drives his processionality inside. Let us turn to the personality of Akhmatova for confirmation of this thesis. Akhmatova had a second emotion with her first will. He types her as a VELF. And as was said before, the second emotion is born Akin, singing everything he sees around him. Akhmatova herself actually admitted her akinistic understanding of the tasks of poetry, saying that poetry consists of simple phrases like, would you like some tea? However, contrary to such a declaration, which presupposes abundant fruiting, Akhmatova's poetic legacy is neither large in form nor distinguished by a large number of works. The secret of such restraint was once discovered by Akhmatova herself while analyzing Simanov's poems. Then she said a courageous military commander, his whole chest covered in orders, in a whiny voice counts women's infidelities. Here's one, and here's another. A man should hide it in his chest, like in a grave. So in other words, she was making fun of this guy who was kind of like whinily talking about various women's like infidelities, and he was like a military man with like a chest full of medals and stuff, and yet he was like being whiny, and she was like, a man should hide it in his chest, like in a grave. A man like he should presume a more noble demeanor. The point is that Akhmatova was not just an Akin, according to the second emotion, but according to the first will, a royal Akin, for whom not everything is allowed in poetry, but only that which does not compromise the dignity, does not hurt the author's pride, and generally goes back to a hierarchical, elevated system of themes and images, placing the poet in an exceptional position above the crowd. The principle of silence of royal Akinism is precisely stated by Pushkin in Boris Godunov when Tsar Boris, instructing his son, says, and I'm pretty sure it cuts off. Oh no, nope, we have it here. Be silent. The royal voice should not be lost in vain in the air. Like a holy bell, it should only announce great sorrow or great holiday. Pushkin was not a 1V type, by the way, or at least Afanasiev does not believe he was 1V. He types Pushkin as EFVL. So just a note there. This principle was very close to Akhmatova. It was not for nothing that she herself called the word royal in her. She was. It was not for nothing that she herself called the word royal in her poems. Maybe she called herself royal in the poems, or not sure what that means. And the small volume of her legacy seems to confirm the assumption of the poet's purely elitist approach to creativity. And at the same time, at first glance, it confirms the previously expressed idea that the first will, with its aristocratic manners, cancels the processionalism and versatility of the second function, in this case, the second emotion. Everything is so, and everything is not so. One woman who slept for some time in the same room with Akhmatova said that for the first nights she could not sleep, because Anna Andreevna in her sleep was constantly either muttering something or singing. The words could not be distinguished, only the rhythm, completely definite and persistent. It seemed like she was all buzzing like a beehive. Amazing evidence, isn't it? Raped by Akhmatova's first will during the waking period, the second emotion still breaks through during the period of unconsciousness and does its assigned achinical work of poetic formulation of everything experienced during the day, without dividing into worthy and unworthy, low and high. Humming at night like Akhmatova's beehive, it is an ideal image for embodying the idea of the indestructibility of the processional principle in a person, no matter how it is trampled by the excessive first will. However, even temporary relaxation in sleep is not able to compensate the king for the torment of daytime self-torture and remove the general tragic background of life. As another poet so accurately said, "Peace and quiet within me, I have narrowed my circle by will, but I cry in my sleep when the knot weakens." Another tragic motive in the life of the Tsar is contained in his voluntaristic slogan, "If you want, then everything will work out." So if you want it, then you'll get it, if you truly want it. The tragedy here lies in the very unreality of the slogan, the deliberate refusal to compromise with the environment, nature, the world, society, other people's wills and desires. If you want it, everything will work out, First Volition shouts, peeing against the wind, but the spray does not fly where First Will wants, but where the wind blows. And with this mournful discord between a vital, completely organic slogan and the living environment, the king cannot do anything. I've heard that phrase from multiple 1V types, not verbatim, but paraphrase that, if you want it, if you truly want it, then, you'll get it, or things will work out. The universe will bend to your will. It will bend to your fate. And they have this kind of demeanor, like, if they just keep, plowing through, like, things will work out. Well, sometimes that is true. Sometimes, the world, you just got to put a little bit of, determination and grit behind yourself, and eventually things do work out through sheer persistence. But, that's based on, a good situation happening. But sometimes, like you said, the wind blows differently and you get piss all over your legs. So nothing lives up to the first will like power. Calvin, who had been suffering from severe illnesses since his youth, wrote in his letter, and of course, Calvinism, like, look at that brand of Christianity where, you have like an elect who were destined always to be saved, and then, the vast majority of people who are the unelect and will not be saved, and everything is like predetermined. Yeah, you can see like the first will kind of rearing its head there. So Calvin, who had been suffering from severe illnesses since his youth, wrote in his letters without any coquetry, "My life is like a continuous dying. Having seized power in Geneva, he lived, burying his loved ones and comrades. With iron hoops of will squeezing his collapsing organism, Calvin, inspired by the power he had over his fellow citizens, lived and worked with superhuman effort in such a way that even the rich Calvinist church is still not able to publish the complete collection of his works. It is so enormous. The first will loves power, loves with pure love, devoid of foreign impurities. For her, power is not a means of achieving wealth or realizing long-standing plans, but a goal that is valuable in itself. Because remember, the first function is the final end. Okay, it's what the psychotypology is. It's your psychology is possessed by. So 1V types are possessed by the will. The will is the end in itself. Okay. One of Churchill's biographers wrote that if at the time Churchill and Lloyd George had been asked why they went to Parliament, then if they had been sincere, they would have answered to become ministers. And why become ministers? Both would confidently say in order to become prime minister. And why? Churchill would answer this question: in order to be prime minister. The life credo of the first will was ideally stated by one hero of Turgenev's story, First Love. Jeez, hiccuping. I quote an excerpt on this topic in full. It is so expressive and lapidary that there is practically nothing to add to it. Take what you can yourself, but don't give it into your hands. Belonging to yourself is the whole point of life, he once told me. Another time, as a young Democrat, I began to talk about freedom in his presence. Freedom, he repeated. Do you know what freedom can give a person? What? Will, your own will, and it will give power, which is better than freedom. Know how to want, and you will be free, and you will be in command. The king's unshakable confidence in his right to power is a strength and at the same time his Achilles heel. The fact is that fate often deprives the king of the throne during his lifetime, and it is precisely such a blow that the iron but fragile first will often cannot withstand. One of the same Churchill's contemporaries, having visited him, who had just lost his ministerial portfolio, wrote, "What strange moods he had. When he's on the rise, he has complete self-confidence. When he is down, he falls into deep depression." Fortunately, the young body of the then Churchill withstood the blow, but it also happened differently, when loss of power and death turned out to be connected by an equal sign. Despite the power of the second physics, I think it's Tvardovsky, Tvardovsky and Napoleon, the first after his dismissal from the post of editor-in-chief of Navi Mir, burned out like candles. Okay, so despite the power of the second physics, after the dismissal, they burned out like candles. Okay. The first will is too strong, therefore it is not flexible and is very fragile. It is interesting that the problem of the fragility of the first will seriously interested Sophocles during the period of writing Antigone, and here are the conclusions he came to. Too unyielding disposition, most likely to give up. The strongest, fire-heated damask steel, is more likely to be broken and broken. And the wisest people have no shame in listening to others and being persistent in moderation. You know, trees in winter showers, bending down, retain their branches, but stubborn ones are torn out by their roots. He who pulls the sail too tight and does not loosen it will be capsized, and his boat will float upside down. Of course, the death of a career or lack of prospects is perceived tragically by the first will, but they do not cancel the desire to rise up, but only stimulate the search for new non-standard career paths. Hence the sudden changes, incomprehensible to others, that often plague the fate of the Tsar. Oh yeah, just changing plans on a whim. That's without telling anyone, and then being very driven to stick to the new plan. I mean, or to for now to appear as though that the new plan is everything. That's a big 1V thing. Okay. Here's a typical story on this topic told by the famous psychologist Stephen Berglass. One day a patient came to him allegedly feeling remorse for sacrificing his family for work. I suggested that he start going to church with his family, recalls Berglass, but instead of just attending services, he became a deacon. That is, he again chose the position over family fellowship. To what has been said, we can add that the hero of the story went to both a psychologist and church only because, and it cuts off, unfortunately. It would have been interesting to know what he was saying there. First will is a born leader. For her, managing people is as easy and natural as breathing. Usually the king does not say directly, I have plenty of will, so give me yours and follow me. I am responsible for everything. But he, like no one else, knows how to behave like someone in power, and people involuntarily obey, not so much seeing as feeling the king like chickens feel the alpha chicken. Yeah. The assessment of the talent of the first will to lead people can be twofold, depending on the circumstances. On the one hand, this talent is more valuable than ever in times of disasters, troubles, and confusion. The ability to cement society and lead it, even if unity was not achieved without violence and the goals are dark, is still a good thing, because it simply allows society to save itself and survive. And vice versa. In times of peace, calm, harmony, nothing harms society more than the talent of the leader of the first will, because it is inseparable from monologue, authoritarianism, suppression of the individual, from the deadening uniformity of behavior, thoughts, and feelings. Okay. So in other words, it suppresses it deadens it creates a deadening uniformity of behavior, thoughts, and feelings. Margaret Thatcher's father, from whom she most likely inherited her first will, bequeathed to his daughter, never follow the crowd. Do not be afraid to be different from it, and if necessary, lead it with you. These words from the father of the future prime minister briefly and succinctly outline not just personal experience and views, but the universal strategy of the first will in its interaction with the crowd. The Tsar really never mixes with it, does not ride in the wagon train, rarely stands on the side of traffic, and constantly strives to be at its head. And how can he not strive to be at the head of the crowd? After all, only with her participation can natural leadership talent be realized. After all, there is no king without a retinue, the sky is empty without the earth, and the top reveals itself only in the presence of the bottom. So the desire of the first will to be at the head of everything is not to say legal, but natural. And one more conclusion. Due to the specific relationship between the king and the crowd, despite all his inveterate individualism, he is a very social, very dependent being living with the crowd in an almost mystical, hypostatic connection, in a state of inseparability and non-fusion. I live for show, for people, Tolstoy groaned, and continued such an ostentatious existence. At the same time, being a dependent being, the king, like no one else, is unceremonious in his relations with those who have become dependent on him, and there is no more consistent and arrogant rapist in the world than the first will. And by rapist, I wouldn't think of that sexually. I would again think of it as like, raping as in like taking from, like just kind of like aggressively taking from. So they take from their subordinates and they have no problem like reaching into the pockets of their subordinates or ordering their subordinates around or like, sacrificing people like pawns. Okay. That's what he's trying to say there. However, the king is more of a dictator than a tyrant. Okay. Not tolerating contradictions, he still believes too much in his natural right to power to be seriously afraid of competition and become embittered in fear of it. So historically speaking, when we talk about like a tyrant, it's usually somebody who has an illegitimate sovereignty and is very fearful and fretting about competitors to their power and about secret plots against them. So the tyrant is like a paranoid figure. Whereas for the 1V type, so that the tyrant figure would be more like a 3V, okay, because they're neurotic, self-doubting. But the king is more of a dictator, meaning that he just believes he has a right to power. So he oftentimes he's not really afraid of competition, unless competition is a serious, like obvious problem. But he's not paranoid about competition and not embittered by it because he's like, no, I'm the king, I have the right, It's just my right. I'm the best. So, the first will is born as a leader. Actually, let me take a sippy sip real quick. The first will is born as a leader, but perhaps even more than confident in his right to rule, a king is born confident in his right to disobedience. Time and circumstances do not always contribute to the realization of the natural right of the first will to power. But the holiday of disobedience is a holiday that is always with you, a holiday that can be celebrated every day, regardless of time and circumstances. Therefore, the first will is not always a leader, but always an uncontrollable person. I remember how my old friend shouted, once again being fired from his job, "Understand, you can't give orders to me." Uncontrollability is the earliest sign of the first will. Children kings are the most stubborn, the most difficult children in the world. It is almost impossible to come to an agreement with them. Violence does not work. Tears are useless. At the age of 7, Charles the 12th of Sweden, having been taken out of his father's office, having taken out of his father's office because the hour for the ministerial meeting had arrived, first knocked long and persistently on the closed door, and then simply ran into it with his head. The bloodied, unconscious boy, of course, was carried into the office, although he had nothing to do there. In childhood, even direct, obvious personal gain does not make the first will flexible. It rebels chronically, with or without reason, in a variety of forms. Describing his childhood, Salvador Dali said, "The child king turned into an anarchist, against everything and everyone." Against everything and everyone became my motto and guide to action. As a child, I always acted differently from everyone else, but I didn't think about it. Now I realize the exceptionality of my behavior and began to deliberately act against all expectations. As soon as someone said black, I retorted white. As soon as someone raised his hat in greeting, I did not miss the opportunity to publicly spit and curse. I felt so different that any accidental coincidence of my actions with someone else would throw me into a trance. I could burst into tears with rage. I'm not like everyone else. I'm different no matter what it costs me. I am not like anyone or anything. I am the only one. Listen, one. With age, however, the opposition of the first will becomes more meaningful. It ceases to rebel over trifles and to direct harm to itself. But uncontrollability as such remains the norm of czarist behavior, multiplying the ranks of putschists, right-wingers, reformers, litigators, anarchists, schismatics, complete reactionaries, and no less complete radicals of all stripes. Let us ask ourselves, is the uncontrollability of the first will good or bad? Well, as they say, our shortcomings are a continuation of our strengths. Therefore, the rebellious spirit inherent in the first will is double-edged. On the one hand, he is vitally necessary for society. He is the touchstone on which the dull, stagnant public consciousness is constantly sharpened. It is no coincidence that Socrates said about himself that he was assigned to Athens like a gadfly to a horse, large and noble, but lazy from obesity and in need of being driven. The first will is the enemy of everything ordinary, familiar, banal, and in this enmity lies its main value for society. On the other hand, the intrinsic value of rebellion often leads the first will into the camp of reaction, forcing it to row against the current, right against the wind, and rape reality. Returning to Socrates, who compared himself to a gadfly, we can say that the king is a gadfly who stings everyone's bottoms, regardless of whether they need it or not. Therefore, the dilemma, who is the first will, a noble rebel or an empty frondeur, is insoluble. He is both and altogether, depending on the circumstances. If the king is religious, and this is often the case, again, interesting that, it's often the case that, first volition is religious. There's something spiritual going on with volition. Okay. Then the rebellious spirit creates additional tragicomic and insoluble difficulties for the first will in its relationship with God. It is impossible to understand how Gorky managed to spy this drama in Tolstoy's soul, but the fact remains that he saw and described. The thought that noticeably, more often than others, sharpens his heart is the thought of God. Sometimes it seems that this is not a thought, but intense resistance to something that he feels above himself. He has a very vague relationship with God, but sometimes they remind me of the relationship of two bears in one den. Surprisingly true and not only applicable to Tolstoy, the problem named by Gorky, the general drama of the mystical-minded first will. Again, mystical-minded. On the one hand, The usual religious picture, where the Lord Almighty arbitrarily carries out judgment and reprisals on the lower created world, is a balm in the heart of the king, since thereby the domestic and social arbitrariness carried out by the king is sanctified and supported by the highest authority. But on the other hand, by affirming his own monarchical credo, with reference to the supreme monarchical principle, the king, along with the rest of the created world, himself falls under the Lord's invisible jurisdiction, which his rebellious soul cannot bear in any way. Atheistic rebellion occurs in the first will, sometimes at a very tender age, and is obviously of an unconscious nature. For when little Toulouse-Lautrec was brought to church for the first time, he immediately shouted, "I want to pee. Yes, I want to pee here." And despite the entreaties of his family, translation ends, but I'm guessing he peed. Okay. Thus, from the religious bifurcation of the first will, we get what Gorky very aptly called the relationship of two bears and one den. God building and God fighting miraculously coexist in the soul of the king, sometimes cheering it, sometimes oppressing it, and this is forever. There is neither complete reconciliation with God nor complete divorce from him for the mystically inclined first will. Oh man, very relevant to my life. Not me personally, but certain people I know. The Tsar is an amazing creature. He never relaxes. His self-control is absolute. Like a knight clad in the armor of his iron will, a king passes through life alien to passions, temptations, weaknesses, and attachments. Even the fourth function, which was said, a person usually willingly releases and entrusts to others, the first will releases and entrusts only to the extent of his interest in it. The degree of self-control of the king can be judged at least by the example of Napoleon, who, at the height of the Battle of Wagram, fell asleep, slept under the roar of cannonade for 10 minutes, and then, as if nothing had happened, again took command of the troops into his own hands. Pretty Chad of him. I myself am not one of those who are subject to the charms of strangers, Akhmatova declared. The most reliable sign of the first will. Among its owners, there are almost no alcoholics or drug addicts. Toulouse-Lautrec and Twardowski's weakness for drinking are the rarest exceptions. Loss of self-control, relaxation caused by the effects of alcohol or drugs, or third-party influence in general, are completely unacceptable for the king. The power of someone or something over oneself, dependence on someone or something is equivalent for the first will to the loss of one's I, the self-destruction of the first support function. Okay. Despite the fact that the first will is an unusually integral creation made of one stone, from the outside it looks like something contradictory, bifurcated, and inconsistent. However, if you take a closer look, it turns out that the inconsistency of the first will is better characterized by the words ambivalence, hypostasis, and is entirely associated with the problem of power. There are three positions in which the face of the first will manifests, as it were, three dissimilar expressions. When the king does not claim power, when he does, and when he has it. Not engaged in the struggle for power, the first will, of all the traits inherent in it, outwardly shows only two: an unshakable belief in a two-stage hierarchical model of the universe and uncontrollability. In all other respects, she bears little resemblance to the king. He is a law-abiding, very decent person, a reliable friend and business partner. And the Tsar, who is not engaged in the struggle for power, has practically no reasons for violating the norms of law and morality. There are difficulties. Excess will is spent only on protecting one's own sovereignty, and life takes on obvious features of asociality, celibacy, loneliness, egocentrism, etc., which is quite uncomfortable for such an essentially social creature as the king. As for the differences between the Tsar, who is fighting for power, and the one who has it, they are insignificant, although the diametrical contradiction of the slogans misleads many. The simpletons, seeing the opposition Tsar in power, begin to scratch their heads and recall old aphorisms about the perniciousness of power. But in fact, no metamorphoses occur to him, and while fighting tyranny and asserting it, the first will does not betray itself at all, because anarchy and dictatorship are two equal sides of its nature. Yep. A common picture in world history, an ardent opponent of arbitrariness makes a revolution. Then, grasping the helm of power, carries out more or less velvet counter-revolution and establishes a tyranny even worse than before. It would be too simple and convenient to explain such metamorphoses by the deliberate intention of a scoundrel disguised as a Democrat. The reality is more complex and tragic. They say that during the dispersal of the National Assembly, Napoleon fainted, and Lenin was hysterical on the day of the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly. Cromwell asserted his dictatorship even more painfully. He, a powerful defender of the humiliated Parliament, an implacable enemy of absolutism, having become the head of the country, made many attempts to assemble Parliament in a variety of combinations convenient for himself. But here's the bad luck. Each of the 10 parliaments dared to claim at least a share of the absolute power that was already in the hands of Cromwell, and they had to be dispersed. A significant part of the life of the English Lord Protector passed in this painful creation and destruction of ephemeral democracy. What is here just naked ambition? No, this is the tragic dialectic of the first will. The more irreconcilable and consistent the tyrannical struggle, the greater the chance that it will be followed by an unconscious, painfully formed, but inexorable tyranny, a result. Okay. Referring to like result volition. After coming to power, the Tsar's views on the management structure also changed diametrically. Being an ardent supporter of self-government in opposition, he begins his reign with a consistent replacement of the system of self-government by a close structure of officials appointed by the center, completely independent of the population. According to this principle, the Cromwellian system of governor-generals, the Napoleonic system of prefectures, the Leninist system of regional committees, etc., were formed. Okay, the Tsar does not even have to be a politician to be a very tough politician. Freud, for example, was formally engaged in science but built his psychological school as a theocratic state with an infallible, charismatic leader, a bureaucracy, a court, a police force, a propaganda department, etc. In a similar way, literary circles, fashion houses, and in general, all kinds of associations with more than one member are often formed, having the bitter happiness of falling under the stone hand of the first will. Noteworthy is the degradation that usually occurs with the retinue of the king after he achieves power. I will note the main thing. The first will of individuals is not afraid. She herself feels like a super personality. Therefore, the retinue of the times of the opposition and the first cabinet of the Tsar can be brilliant, the real cream of society. So, in other words, like right after the retinue of the Tsar during the time of opposition and right after achieving power can be a very brilliant group of people. Like brilliant as in not just intelligent, but as in like, capable. Okay. But time passes, and a strange at first glance but consistent process of washing out individuals from the environment of the first will begins. And the point is not that the Tsar, having taken the helm of power in his hands, becomes less confident in himself and experiences fear of a possible rival, but that the first will can confront the crowd but only rule individually. The first to leave the king and slamming the door are 1V types. The second, and without slamming the door, the second will types will just eliminate themselves from the group. And what remains is the Camarilla, the untalented, hardworking, and the translation blanks off, but I'm guessing, he means like 4V types, which I don't agree that they're untalented or necessarily hardworking, but I think 4V types would be probably the only ones to stick around. But in any case, perhaps it's specifically as he goes on, he talks about like untalented, low quality people. Maybe he means, the untalented 4V types. The low quality level of the retinue, however, is of little concern to the first will. It needs performers, not individuals. One statement by Napoleon is typical in this regard. I am my own minister. I run my own affairs, and therefore I am strong enough to take advantage of mediocre people. Honesty, lack of honesty, lack of talkativeness, and efficiency. That's all I require. Loyalty is a main condition for a stable and warm relationship with the first will. If it is present, then other virtues or vices of the environment seem unimportant to it. Essentially, the king doesn't give a damn about the symbol of faith and the ideology that he officially professes, whose name he swears and calls for. He doesn't work for slogans, but slogans work for him. Robespierre, a staunch Republican and fierce opponent of the monarchy, noted in his papers, "A united will is needed. It needs to be a Republican. It needs to be Republican or Royalist. That is, political principles are indifferent, as long as they can lead him to the top of the social pyramid." Robespierre himself did not manage to become an absolute monarch, but his political successor, Napoleon, easily accomplished what was required by the first will evolution, from ardent republican to emperor. The Tsar is also unscrupulous in his means. Stubbornly, with his head held high, he walks through the mud, spit, and blood. It is better for people not to judge the results, leaving the judgment to God and history. However, some forecasts of the historical trial of the first will can be made now. In politics, it is her destiny to win battles and lose campaigns. Even when, through rebellion, the Tsar achieves supreme power, Cromwell, Robespierre, Napoleon, Lenin, Hitler, he often ends badly, and his cause turns out to be stillborn. There are two reasons for this. Obviously, the first logic. So it's weird. I think there's a typo here. I think it's supposed to be. There are two reasons for this. Obviously, the logic of the Tsar is not distinguished by strategic thinking, and at best is effective in solving tactical problems. And I think, yeah, I think what he's saying is that the logic that follows will is not distinguished by strategic thinking because, I mean, it can be, but the point is that remember earlier when we had talked about when I had read through and commented on the first will. I'm sorry, when I commented on the first logic. The first logic is the only type of logic that sees logic as an end to in and of itself. Okay, and I think strategy is really in the domain of the first logic type, really the first logic type with second will or even third will. Okay. Um, those are the types that are probably the most strategic and the most like far-sighted. Okay. Um, whereas the logic for the 1V type, while he can be a brilliant and intelligent person and a philosopher, he's not truly strategic because his thinking is going to be biased by will, and there will be times when logic will say one thing about how to proceed, but his will be so set on a goal or a vision that they will engage in a sort of magical thinking and deny logic it's time to shine. So they'll engage, they'll use logic tactically, but they will compromise logic when it comes to strategy. Um, Secondly, the effectiveness and monologue of the first will, usually for the first function, does not imply any other final goal than the achievement and retention of absolute personal power, which is difficult to tolerate by contemporaries and is fruitless for the future. Monologue and effectiveness make the first will a born, often unconscious monarchist, and then I think the translation would have continued but doesn't, although that bit in and of itself is basically a complete statement. Yeah, I don't know how much that is true. The achievement and retention of absolute personal power, it is difficult to tolerate by contemporaries. I don't know if it is fruitless for the future, just because at a certain to some extent, and I'm setting aside my 2V here, but it is true that you know while it may be not ideal, this or that person in charge, having someone in charge and uniting a society or a group under like a single will can get shit done. So, for posterity's sake, it can be beneficial that the first will, you know, in and of itself, it's the will in and of itself a, is not productive for the future, but once the will achieves power, then it allows the other functions to then do their work. So, a lot can be done for posterity indirectly by way of the first will, if that makes sense. Um, and further, I didn't want the reader to get the impression of First Will as a cruel tyrant who automatically professes Caligula's principle, let them hate as long as they fear. No, the king is more of a dictator than a tyrant. Of course, political life under his steely right hand can only exist as a ghost. But this does not mean that there is no feedback between the Tsar and the people. The relationship between government and society in this case is built on the principle called democratic centralism by Lenin. No matter how wild the name sounds, such a system of relations in world history is unprecedented, and its content was exhaustively formulated by Council C's. Power must come from above and trust from below. Um, so the thing, it's strange. No matter how wild the name sounds, such a system of relations in world history is unprecedented. I think maybe that's a typo. Maybe that should be is precedented. Um, because what he's talking about, this dynamic, is actually very precedented in world history. Um, but in any case, power must come from above and trust from below. That is, power comes from power, but it must be based on popular trust. Do not go into direct. So, in other words, do not go into direct confrontation with society. Um, So therefore, usually the Tsar strangles only political life and what is related to the third function. So the Tsar, being 1B, he strangles political life. He's an absolute ruler, right? But he also strangles what is related to the third function, but not the other two. So now he's going to list what these third function analogies would be. So third physics, he would strangle the economy, right? And we could add to that like anything material about society. Maybe something to do with like public health. So he micromanages the economy. He micromanages health, maybe aesthetics to some extent, the more decorative side of aesthetics, and yeah, anything physical, right? Uh, for third logic, he strangles publicity, and what this would also entail would be like publicity, meaning like the press, right? The media at large, universities, and anything that deals with thinking, right? Anything that deals with knowledge and information. The third logic is going to like clamp down on that because of their fear and neuroticism about and their inferiority complex regarding thought, okay, and free thought. And then third emotion would strangle the pathos and mysticism of life. And I would add to this, it's basically art and culture. The uh, um, third emotion, 1V types, if they achieve like absolute power, will predictably strangle like art, culture, music, and attempt to micromanage it and censor it. However, the first will usually agrees to leave everything else free. Therefore, the king is more of a dictator than a tyrant. As Stendhal wrote about Napoleon, a tyrant ruled, but there was little arbitrariness. So basically, like 1V types, they are kind of laissez faire in a way. It's like, as long as they have power, they're kind of good to like just, be content with that. And then, yeah, they'll dabble and micromanage the stuff that kind of irks them in regards to their third position, but otherwise, like they're not seeking to really, like in a paranoid way, completely control society. Um, they're content to kind of like let life go on as it was before, as long as they have absolute political power. Okay, my voice is holding up so far. The inflexibility of the volitional principle of the Tsar, caused by monologue and effectiveness, makes his life uncomfortable not only in society but also in the family. Rebels and dictators are not liked anywhere, and the family is no exception here. Family life is especially difficult for queens. In addition to the usual struggle of wills in which everyone always participates, regardless of gender and age, A woman with first will is under pressure from public opinion, which automatically assigns her a subordinate position in the family. It is not surprising that planning to hang up on her part becomes a norm of life and takes on exaggerated forms of permanent rebellion, which obviously does not make living together any easier. Akhmatova, for example, admitted that the struggle for independence ruined a lot in her relationship with Gumilyov and left a remarkably brief and succinct example of presenting her position in conflicts with her husband's. Submissive to you? You've gone crazy. I am submissive to the Lord's will alone. I don't want either trembling or pain. My husband is an executioner, and his house is a prison. Life is a little easier for men with first will when it comes to sorting out relationships with members of the household. Although public opinion gives him some head start, the king is not always able to exercise his legitimate right to arbitrariness. The wife's character, contrary to expectations, often turns out to be anything but plasticine, and the domestic battle takes on the same forms described above. Here, for example, in the situation of the family of young Gandhi, I constantly watched her every step. She did not dare leave the house without my permission. This led to quarrels. The ban I imposed was actually something like imprisonment, and Kasturbai was not the kind of girl to easily submit to such demands. She decided that she could go wherever she wanted and whenever she wanted. The more I forbade her, the more she resisted, and the angrier I became. The birth of children usually does not pacify, but expands and complicates the conflict. Subordinating children to their will seems to the king to be an easier and more natural thing, which is only partly fair, for the time being, and ends in a fierce confrontation on the part of the grown-up children, the bitterness of which is directly proportional to the pressure previously applied. One of Tolstoy's sons, greatly spreading the colors, nevertheless admitted, we not only loved him, he occupied a very large place in our lives. And we felt that he was suppressing our personalities, so sometimes we wanted to break out from under this pressure. In childhood, it was an unconscious feeling. Later, it became conscious, and then a certain spirit of contradiction towards my father appeared in me and my brothers. As the children grow up and expand, the king's family splits. The translation might have continued there, but that's fine. Peace and tranquility in the family of the king can only exist if the members of the household are absolutely loyal. The love of the first will is despotic and possible only when it deliberately looks down on the partner. Ivan Bunin, knowing firsthand the character of the Tsar, briefly and accurately described the tyrannical background of his love. Yes, she touched me most at that hour when, braiding her hair at night, she came up to me to kiss me goodbye, and I saw how much smaller than she is than me, without heels, how she looks up into my eyes. I felt love for her most strongly in moments of expressing the greatest devotion to me, abandoning myself. In essence, the king is a deeply lonely man. You are a king, live alone, Pushkin said on a different occasion, but definitely. In the first will, the self, the superpersonal principle, and the individualism are too strong for it to experience a genuine craving for pairing. It may sound offensive, but the first will is not given to love. To truly love, the king is given to need, to depend, but not to love. True love is not consumption, but sacrifice, even personal self-destruction for the sake of another being. What the first will is completely incapable of. Although the word love never left Tolstoy's tongue, according to his own admissions, he never had the opportunity to love. He had exclusively sexual interests in Sofia Andreevna and was clearly burdened by this kind of attachment. I don't like women, I don't like cards, I don't like anything. Sounds like a fun guy. Frankly speaking, the king is too busy with himself, loves himself too much to transfer a significant part of this feeling to others, and by and large is deeply indifferent to everything that is not part of his I. Here are the three views, one from the inside, two from the outside, on the problem of the attitude of the first will to others. I think that every person is proud, and everything that a person does is all out of pride. Self-love is a conviction that I am better and smarter than all people. Why do we love ourselves more than others? Because we consider ourselves better than others, more worthy of love. If we found others better than ourselves, then we would love them more than ourselves. Tolstoy about Tolstoy. He often, this is a tough one. He often seemed to me a man who was unshakably, in the depths of his soul, indifferent to people. He is so much higher and more powerful than them that they all seem to him like midges, and their vanity is funny and pathetic. Gorky about Tolstoy. I understood Lev Nikolaevich's selfishness and indifference to everything better. For him, the same world is what surrounds his genius, his creativity. He takes from everything round him only that which serves as a service element for his talent, for his work. Tolstoya about Tolstoy. Is there love here? Before speaking about the independence of the first will from alcohol and drugs, I said that it is connected with the impossibility of the king to fall under any authority. The same picture with love, by which he usually means his dependence on someone. Love, even in such a reduced form, is still power, and the first will does not tolerate power over itself in any form. Therefore, the king not only does not truly love, but avoids love and feels more comfortable without it. My voice is weak, but my will does not weaken. I even feel better without love. Akhmatova. The young Napoleon wrote about the same thing, but in prose. What is love? This consciousness of one's own weakness, which soon completely takes possession of a lonely person. At the same time, this is a feeling of loss of power over oneself. I consider love harmful both for the whole of society and for a person's personal happiness, that it causes more harm than it gives joy. And truly the gods would do a true benefit to humanity if they freed the world from it. But the boomerang returns, and people pay the king in kind. Grandfather Apishka, the prototype of Grandfather Eroshka from Cossacks, once directly told Tolstoy that he was somehow unloved. Let us note that this is said about a person whose emotion and physics are processional, i.e. about a creature in theory created for love. Okay, so Tolstoy, VEFL, so E and F are in the middle, second and third, so he had said before, in fact, multiple times, Afanasiev had said that, the processional functions are more, more fair, more collaborative and mutual, right? So if your emotion and physics are in the middle, then, you should, in theory, have a very lovely nature. And yet there's a lot of truth in this phrase that Tolstoy was somehow unloved. The first will is more often respected, valued, feared than loved. Internal alienation, the selfhood of the first will, separates with a wall anyone who would like to merge externally and internally. Oh man, I'm fighting the yawns on this one. Losing spectacularly. Separates with a wall anyone who'd like to merge externally and internally with it to become one. Right, because 1V has a very strong frame. Right, they have a very thick wall and sense of self. The transformation of 2 into 1 is the highest manifestation of love. However, the distance that the first will automatically establishes between itself and others obviously excludes such a merger, and people feel it. Being incapable of love, the king is at the same time terribly jealous. Moreover, his jealousy is not at all related to physiology, like the 3F, or rather not only to physiology. Tolstoy, who is a 1V and a 3F, was noticeably jealous of his friend, director Sulerzytsky for Gorky, although he was not homosexual. For the fact is that the first will does not get stuck on sex, but longs for the possession of the entire being of the person who falls into its field, and demands devotion not only with the body, but also with the soul. The Tsar wants only people to smile at him, only listen to him, only take him into account. I think that's pushing it a little too far. But take it as, just understand the ideal picture he's painting of this stereotype, which is unrealistic and dooms the first will, with its boundless egocentrism, to the chronic torment of jealousy, equally poisoning the lives of both itself and those around it. Frankly, the most dubious and vulnerable point in Freud's teachings always seemed to me to be that which concerns the Oedipus complex. As far as I can remember, with great love for my mother, I was never jealous of her father, and was even proud of him for the chivalrous manifestation of love for his wife, which he very simply and openly demonstrated. Therefore, it is natural that, having become acquainted with the teachings of Freud, the concept of the Oedipus complex was not accepted at all and was considered pure fiction. Uh, Now I confess I was wrong. Freud judged by himself, I judged by myself, which is generally inherent in everyday egocentric psychology. Is completely fruitless and gives nothing but mutual irritation. So now it is necessary to admit that the Oedipus complex is not a myth. It does exist, but firstly, it is not universal. Secondly, jealousy, not always sexually charged, is inherent in a certain part of society, represented by the first will. As for the Oedipus complex itself, where jealousy, judging by the description, has a distinctly sexual connotation and is transferred even to relatives with the opposite sex sign, then according to my calculations, it affects a fairly narrow circle of kings who have the first will combined with third physics. This combination really is an explosive mixture that can cause that feeling. So VLFE types and VLFE types and VEFL types would be the ones who he's kind of picking on in the past couple paragraphs, as well as next. You're going to see in the next paragraphs he goes pretty far afield, but um, he's picking on those types. So Leo Tolstoy had a combination of first will and third physics, but he was not an Oedipus in its classical version. Tolstoy's mother died early, his sister went to a monastery, so he transferred the usual jealousy in such cases to his daughters and hatred on sons-in-law. In the novel Sunday, Tolstoy, having awarded his complex to the hero of the novel Nekhlyudov, I don't know how to pronounce that, confessed as follows, blah, blah, blah. Although he hid it from himself, although he struggled with this feeling, hated his son-in-law. He was antipathetic to him for his vulgarity of feelings, self-confident, narrow-mindedness, and most importantly, he was antipathetic for his sister, who could so passionately, selfishly, and sensually love this poor nature. It was always excruciatingly painful for blah 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 to think that Natasha was the wife of this hairy, glossy, bald, self-confident man. He couldn't even contain his disgust for his children, and every time I found out that she was preparing to become a mother, I felt a feeling similar to condolences that she had again become infected with something bad from this person who was alien to all of them. Freud apparently experienced the same feelings, and since the tradition of attributing their own ills to all humanity did not begin with Freud and did not end with him, we can say that the phenomenon of the Oedipus complex is interesting, not for its content, but for its origin, once again affirming the long-standing thesis about complete mental callousness, deafness, and egocentrism of human nature. I don't want to scare anyone, which he always uses that same phrase whenever he's about to say something way fucking out of whack. So prepare yourself. But I don't want to scare anyone. But I suspect that such a rare but still obviously occurring phenomenon as necrophilia owes its existence to the same combination of the first will with the third physics. This combination is especially painful for sex, since in it both potentially vulnerable functions are tested, and the fear of receiving blows to both the will and physics can drag such an Oedipus to copulate with a corpse. As an illustration, I will cite the following documentary story. One day, a police car drove up to the mental hospital, and they took a guy out of it. It turns out that the young man was detained during sexual intercourse with the corpse of a woman in the forensic morgue. How did the guy end up in the morgue? Why did he go there? A girl I knew, a medical student, said, "They say the dead are a common thing for us. We can sit next to them and drink kefir." The guy showed in every possible way that this also did not make any impression on him, although he was timid, shy, and he later admitted was still afraid. And here, corpses, blah blah blah, corpses and the smell. I'm not sure what that translation bit. I think it's garbled. He had never experienced intimate relationships before, nor had he seen an undressed woman. And here are several naked female bodies at once. He couldn't take his eyes off one, a young man, his imagination was so amazed. At this time, he experienced extraordinary sexual arousal and orgasm. It seems that the decisive role in this story was played by the very fact of the deliberate non-conflict of sex, where a young, beautiful body, third physics, all ends up in the complete undivided power, first will of the necrophile. Definitely don't take that one too seriously. Um, okay. The Tsar has a complex attitude towards glory. The main goal of the first will is real power, and not its external attributes titles, orders, applause, throwing caps into the air, etc. Therefore, it usually leaves the impression of a being indifferent to glory, modest, coldly treating the most outspoken sycophants. Um, when asked whether Akhmatova was pleased with fame, Gumilyov, um, Gumilyov replied, and I guess it's like Gumilyov. He replied, "That's the point. It was almost not pleasing. It was as if she didn't want to notice her. Um, if she didn't want them to notice her. But usually, but she unusually suffered from every insult, from every word of a foolish critic, and did not pay attention to successes." Without disputing in principle Gamilyov's opinion, I would like to note that the attitude of the first will to glory is more complicated. To the outward indifference of the Tsar, strange as it may seem, his extreme pride works towards fame, knowing that excessive honors usually have the opposite effect. He is deliberately modest so as not to put himself in an awkward or funny position. Finally, glory for the first will lacks what makes it truly desirable. There is no element of surprise, revolution. The first will knows about itself that it is a superperson, and confirmation from the outside does not add much to the knowledge that it possesses from birth. It does not follow from what has been said that the king is truly indifferent to glory. No, he is very sensitive in this matter and closely monitors how his image develops in society. Akhmatova, according to a contemporary, it was always interesting and important what they said and wrote about her, even when they were unknown people, not like Bloch. And Emperor Augustus even tried to regulate the activities of his sycophants. He allowed only the best writers to write about himself and only in a solemn style, and ordered the praetors to ensure that literary competitions did not damage his name. It seems that having become somewhat carried away, although not without reason, by describing the political face of the first will, I have somewhat forgotten that our shortcomings are a continuation of our merits. The king also has them, and there are many of them: perseverance, purposefulness, determination, unconditional self belief, amazing energy, and a burning thirst for primacy. Not only color the appearance of the first will, but also give a lot to society. Without it, the rest of the wills, meaning the 2V, 3V, and 4V, more inert, inclined to let everything take its course, would really turn, in the apt expression of the hero of Chekhov's duel, our world into a picture covered with flies. Whew. The line separating the king from the rest mortals is invisible, but strangely everyone without seeing it feels it and does not risk stepping over it. Outwardly, the distance between the first will and the other wills is manifested in the emphasized politeness of the forms of addressing the king by others. One of those who closely observed Lenin wrote, "When calling Lenin Ilyich, there is no familiarity. None of his retinue would dare to joke with him or, on occasion, slap him on the shoulder. There was some kind of invisible barrier, a line separating Lenin from other members of the party, and I have never seen anyone cross it." This invisible line separating the first will from the rest appears even more clearly when it appears against the background and in tandem with the will, which stands much lower. In this regard, I cannot help but recall the visits to Russia of Galina Vishnevskaya and Mstislav Rostropovich. The forms of address of those around these equally famous spouses were strikingly different. No one called the owner of the first will Vishnevskaya anything other than respectfully Galina Pavlovna, while even for very green musicians, her husband was still just Slavoshka. So in other words, this highlighted a difference where people were very reverent and polite, talking to the woman and addressing her, whereas her husband, even young new musicians, would refer to him in a very casual way. Akhmatova, remembering Vyacheslav Ivanov, said with envy he was a desperate advertiser, a most experienced virtuoso catcher of men. He, a 44-year-old man, was led by the arms of gray-haired ladies, so he knew how to position himself everywhere. A person who has only momentarily found himself in the field of the king is usually unable to formulate what exactly made him feel the presence of an exceptional chosen being, but the fact that such a feeling arises is unconditional. One Bunin friend of mine, so one friend of Bunin said to Afanasiev, or I'm sorry, uh, ignore that. One friend of Bunin said, the fact that Bunin was a special person was felt by many, almost everyone. He and I once went to buy cakes at Kokelin's pastry shop on the corner of Passy, where I visited often. On my next visit, the cashier asked me, embarrassed, "Excuse me, please, but I really want to know who this gentleman who came up with you the day before yesterday." I answered, not without pride, "The famous Russian writer." But my answer did not make the proper impression on her. "A writer," she said disappointingly. "I thought he was some kind of Grand Duke. He's like that." And she not, so she was struggling. And she, not finding a suitable definition to characterize Bunin, began counting out my change. Although the cashier mentioned above did not undertake to describe the signs by which she guessed the great Grand Duke and Bunin, they exist and with a certain amount of experience are easily read. The look is the first among the external signs of the king. Lawyer Coney described the expression of Tolstoy's eyes this way: the penetrating and seemingly piercing gaze of stern gray eyes, in which shone more inquisitive justice than caressing kindness, at the same time the gaze of a judge and a thinker. Let us add to what Coney said that the first will looks with squinting eyes, focusing and, as it were, strengthening the firmness of his gaze. And yet the expression in the king's eyes strangely combine analytics. Oh man, what is this word? I'm getting tired. We're almost done here. Okay, combines analyticity with aloofness. His gaze seems to ask, "Who are you?" and at the same time warns, "Don't come closer." Yeah. Knowing someone vs, yes, that is, this whole thing is I mean, there's very little in this entire section that's that I could argue with. It's all very good. This, it's way too long, but it's very good. The king's gaze is firm, intent, strict, assertive, and he himself knows the power of his eyes. Emperor Augustus was pleased when, under his gaze, his interlocutor lowered his eyes. Lermontov knew the power of his eyes and loved to confuse and torment timid and nervous people with his long and piercing gaze. I won't insist, but it seems that the staring game that the first will often resorts to dates back to very distant times. After all, it is known that among gorillas, looking into the eyes means a challenge. Therefore, I don't know about chickens, but in people, it's probably through their eyes that the alpha individual, the one in power, is first foreshadowed. The gesture of the first will is royal. Her plasticity is distinguished by calm, grace, and majesty. Moreover, the plasticity of the first will is absolutely natural. There is nothing mannered or affected in it. Its royalty, regardless of origin, is natural and beyond jurisdiction, like the shape of the nose or the color of the eyes. Gorky wrote about Tolstoy, "It was nice to see this being of pure blood. It was nice to observe the nobility and grace of gesture, the proud restraint of speech, to hear the graceful precision of a murderous word. He had just the right amount of master in him as needed for slaves." They said about Gauguin that no matter what he did, even if he brought a match to someone who asked him for a light, his gestures were majestic, as if he were not holding a match but waving a torch. Akhmatova was described something royal, as if existing on top of us and at the same time devoid of the slightest arrogance. I am 100% sure that if you take the frequency dictionary of the vocabulary of the owners of the first will, you will discover a very definite pattern of predominance in their use of the imperative mood, as well as hierarchically elevated words and forms. However, while I don't have such a dictionary at hand, I will give an example that is more curious than scientific. When Margaret Thatcher was informed of the birth of her granddaughter, she exclaimed, "We have become a grandmother." The English press scoffed at this phrase for a long time, and in vain. Her common origin did not in the least prevent the English Prime Minister from feeling her inner aristocracy. And the slip of "we" for her, I think, was more natural than for the great many people who, by right of origin, spoke of themselves in the plural. At the same time, no matter how strange it may seem, while loving the high elitist word, the first will does not disdain the low, rude, obscene word. Perhaps in connection with the universal royal principle, for us the law is not written. In any case, the fact that in the speech of the king there is a certain lexical duality is for sure. It is known how masterly Napoleon knew how to be rude. Or another example from Russian history, when Molotov was asked whether, according to some sources, it was true that Lenin called him a stone ass, he simply answered, "If only they knew what Lenin called others." And one more observation about the speech preferences of the king. When communicating with people close to him, he likes to use all kinds of diminutives, diminishes those around him. Um, so that would be like calling someone named Tom, you'd call them Tommy, right? Let's remember, but in a lot of languages other than English, it's more important because there's like formal ways of addressing people and like familiar ways. So that can be more important in other languages. Let's remember Lenin's textbook, Nadyusha, about Krupskaya, or the lesser known Akhmatova's Borisik, about Pasternak. I think that this tendency towards diminutives comes from the general patristic position of the first will, which perceives others as children, cute, dear, but in need of constant care, infantile beings. On the contrary, diminutive kings are addressed to themselves with gnashing of teeth. On the contrary, when kings hear diminutives addressed to themselves, they gnash their teeth. The same Akhmatova, being in a difficult relationship with Alexei Tolstoy, recalled, Alexei Tolstoy, he looked like Dolokhov. He called me Anushka, which made me shudder, but I liked him. It may seem strange, but the choice of clothing of the king is subject to the ideas given to him once and for all about the vestments befitting his rank and calling. Firstly, he prefers clothes that are the most strict in both color and style. Of course, depending on social affiliation, the clothing of the first will varies greatly, and the artist czar dresses completely differently from the czar politician. However, against the background of its social group, the first will still stands out due to the emphasized severity of its vestments. In this regard, I will cite one tragicomic episode from my own practice. One day I was walking along the street with a young, long-legged queen, and meaning a first will type, and noticing a more than revealing miniskirt ahead, I asked completely tactlessly, why shouldn't she, with such long and slender legs, wear a miniskirt? I can't understand, I can't. My companion barely exhaled, looking at her skirt covering her knees. Who would know how much agony was in her look and voice? Here I once again had to be convinced of the insurmountability of the tragic masochistic principle of the first will, which does not allow, for fear of losing the royal image, even the most innocent freedom. Secondly, being an internally buttoned being, the first will loves buttoned up clothing. To her taste, the more buttons, fasteners, snaps, belts, etc. on clothes, the better. Finally, a sense of personal exclusivity requires a czar to have something completely non-standard, unique in his clothes. And at the same time, the exclusivity in the clothes of the first will should not carry a touch of cheap exoticism or vulgar showiness. Therefore, more often than not, when trying on something, the first will achieves its goal through the archaization of clothing, introducing elements of old taste into it. Akhmatova's false classical shawl. An ideal illustration of the combination of all the above mentioned features of the clothes of the first will is Lenin's troika. Against the backdrop of the military bohemian fashion of his entourage, the Lenin troika stood out for its severity, buttoned upness, and archaic exclusivity. I got to find a picture of that to get what he's talking about. But yeah, that's it for First Will. It's a pretty good section, but man, is it long, and I am completely pooped. That's probably the longest recording I'm going to have here. So yeah, there it is.